Hey nerds, what's up? So for decades now, I've been seeing the multitude of headlines that say various things along the lines of fiction readers are more empathetic. And as someone who grew up quite the reader, I was usually kind of like, that's right. But as I got older, and in particular as I studied statistics in college, I started to become a lot more skeptical of the idea of how they measured this sort of thing and if these studies were actually true. And it always was kind of in the back of my mind as a goal to really dig into that research and see how much validity it had. Well, it's been years, but that time is now. I went into this with a lot of questions and some reservations, which included some of the following. The long-term versus short-term nature of studies. For example, measuring someone's empathy increase after a single story is very different than measuring lifelong readers. 2, the issue of self-reporting. People generally want to come off better than they actually might be, so if a study relies on self-reporting, results can be skewed. 3rd, empathy as a concept in general seems very difficult to measure. And 4, how are we controlling for the personality of the person versus the reading itself? In other words, are there just personalities, like maybe more empathetic people, that are naturally drawn to reading rather than the other way around? This also led to some other questions, like we put a lot of focus on fiction reading, but what about other sources of media? Does cinema and video gaming have similar studies, and are they seen to be empathy increasers? So I set out, armed with my questions, and I read a lot of studies. I mean a lot. I was drowning in the literature. And while I was doing that, another question I wasn't expecting popped up, which is, what do we even mean by empathy? Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it does need to be acknowledged that in life, we casually use the term empathy to actually mean a lot of different things or a lot of different meanings. Now, in casual usage, that doesn't really matter because context usually dictates when we talk to somebody. But when we're talking about research that's supposed to show specific outcomes, specificity does matter. Empathy is a complicated concept, but the research I've read generally describes there being 3 different kinds of empathy. The first being cognitive empathy, or the ability to correctly identify another person's emotions. Affective empathy, the ability to actually feel what that other person is feeling or mirror their feelings. And 3rd, compassionate empathy, the feelings of sympathy and concern that often lead to action. Now, there was a lot of articles I read discussing this and the value of empathy and in reading, and I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, but I do want you to keep in mind these 3 different definitions of empathy because they'll be important as we go forward. So, after sorting through piles of research, it actually seems like the connection between empathy and reading is just generally widely accepted now. It's treated as very real and is also being connected to widely accepted psychological phenomenon such as learning through play. There was even the quoting of a very old philosopher, Aristotle. Man tends most towards representation and learns his first lessons through representation. In fact, the concept of empathy was even first coined in 1908 to describe the ability to feel in works of art. In many ways, empathy and art have always been linked, even if our understanding and knowledge of empathy has grown and evolved. Of course, that doesn't mean there wasn't a lot of bad research on this topic that just did not follow good principles. There was even research that would reference other previous research and say things like, this study said this, and then I'd click through to that study and actually read it, and it was like, did it actually say that though? As I mentioned previously, a lot of the studies also just focused on short-term outcomes, such as measuring empathy before a participant read a fiction story and then measuring empathy after, which may be useful in some circumstances, but for me, I don't find nearly as interesting as really studying what long-term fiction reading has on a person. However, that said, there was also some good stuff too. One of my favorite studies was the 2009 study entitled Exploring the Link Between Reading Fiction and Empathy, Ruling Out Individual Differences and Examining Outcomes by Raymond A. Marr, Keith Oatley, and Jordan B. Peterson. This study pretty much systematically addressed every single reservation I brought up. For example, they tried to study the long-term effects of reading by gathering participants and then making a judgment on whether or not they were readers previously rather than just doing it in the moment. They also established if someone was a reader specifically in a way as to control against self-reporting bias. While not a perfect method, I do appreciate that an attempt was made. They used the artist recognition test, also known as ART, and specifically from their methodology, they described it like this. Because erudition is so closely tied to intelligence and sophistication in our culture, self-report assessments of reading are vulnerable to biased reporting. The original ART, developed by Stanovic and West, overcame the issue by employing a task-based approach that relies upon a single detection logic, allowing for a more objective rather than subjective assessment. Respondents are asked to check off from a list of names those that they recognize as authors. They are explicitly told, however, that a number of the items are fake or foils, i.e. names that are not those of authors, so guessing or indiscriminate checking can easily be detected. While this does not provide a direct measure of the amount of reading a person has done, it is a measure of how much exposure to print an individual has had, which has been found to correlate strongly with book reading and related behaviors. Even if participants have not read a specific author, they are likely to have learned about that person by reading reviews, discussing authors they like, or browsing in bookstores and libraries, all behaviors highly associated with reading itself. Checklist measures of print exposure have been extensively validated. They also attempted to control for other factors and specifically thought about personality traits to control for that idea of, are more empathetic people likely to be readers, or is reading making people more empathetic? They used the Big Five inventory to do personality, as well as controlled for gender, language acquisition, and the ability to be transported through fiction. They also referenced previous studies which had controlled for intelligence. They also attempted to control for self-reporting during the empathy portion of the study by using something called the Mind in the Eye task, or MIE. Self-reported social acumen suffers from a variety of limitations. Most notably, respondents are expected to have access to accurate metacognitive evaluations of their own social ability. Reporting these assessments without bias motivated by social desirability is a second hurdle to accurate measurement. We thus relied on an objective task-based measure of empathy for our study. The MIE requires respondents to examine still pictures of actors' eye regions and choose which of 4 possible mental states is being represented. There's been a lot of previous research on MIE that kind of discusses what it can and can't do, and based on the stuff that I read, it does seem a viable method. However, we'll talk about a limitation of it soon. So, as you can see, this literally ticked off almost every reservation I had, and it was also based heavily on previous studies that seem very important in the sphere of this research, particularly those by Rolf A. Zwan. One of his most referenced projects was the Immersed Experiencer toward an embodied theory of language comprehension, which was very complicated, and I'm not sure I 100% understood everything that was happening in there. There was a lot of jargon I was unfamiliar with, but essentially worked to prove that language can represent experiences. Thus, reading about complex social interactions such as those commonly described in narrative fiction theoretically engages neural substrates similar to those used to navigate similar situations in the real world. Now, there are limitations to this study. For example, a lot of people criticize the Big Five inventory as not really an accurate measure of personality, and in my opinion, the MEI method seems to focus primarily on cognitive empathy and doesn't necessarily seem like a great measure of the other types of empathy. That said, I think the study did try to control as much as possible as can be controlled when we're talking about very complex brain functions and things that are always going to have so many influences that it will always be difficult to pinpoint the influence of a single input value, and which in this case is reading. Ultimately, readers of fiction were shown to have more empathy and really buck the trend of the shy, socially awkward bookworm in that readers tended to have wide social networks that they could call on. The study did note that the ability to be transported by fantasy or the ability to be swept away into narratives did have an impact on results, meaning that the tendency to become highly absorbed in a fictional story also increased someone's ability to learn empathy from it. So no, even the best studies aren't perfect, but honestly, a perfect study in my mind would likely be unethical and would involve separating children into different categories where some were forced not to read and some were forced to read, and you can already see the ethics involved here. Empathy and reading fiction are clearly correlated. I am left with a few questions like, are we actually measuring other types of empathy that leads to action, or are we only measuring cognitive empathy? All three seem important, and proving what kind of empathy we're talking about also seems important because ideally we'd want the kind of empathy that leads to action in daily life, is my guess. And honestly, as important to mention, is the type of empathy people are likely thinking of when they hear this study, not necessarily just cognitive empathy or the ability to correctly identify another person's emotions. They are likely thinking of the kind of empathy we use in everyday conversation, as in, I feel what you are feeling and I can act on that. However, that said, many of you probably don't even care about this evidence and are just saying like, well, duh. Look, for me, I like to see evidence to see if phenomena is widespread or more personal. But quite frankly, myself and I'm sure all of you have a lot of anecdotal evidence that leads to the idea that fiction readers are more empathetic. And I think we'd be talking about all the types of empathy, not just cognitive. After my recent video on book critics and the book review, a viewer sent me one of their favorite book critics, Parul Sagal, and I hope I did not butcher that name. I've been reading through some of their writings and I loved this quote that seemed to be very relevant to the topic today. Occasionally, in a slightly reckless state of mind, I have thought that the real believers where the novel is concerned, the people who truly appreciate the force of fiction, might be those hell-bent on banning it. What powers they ascribe to it, what fearsome potential to corrupt, to alter minds, to sow unrest, to matter. A critic might envy such conviction. I love that quote because it really got me ruminating on how much power we really do ascribe to our fictional reading and how we really obviously, as a society, believe that reading things can change our beliefs and change our beliefs in a way that lead to action. I remember several years ago now, maybe over a decade, reading a book called How to Be a Heroine by Samantha Ellis, a book about how her fictional female literary heroes shaped her and changed actually who she was. But I don't even need to look to people I don't know personally. I can look in my own home. I still remember the adorable moment when my daughter, who was very young at the time, I believe she was only about 4 or 5, came up to me and when she's very shy and she was struggling being outgoing. And she said, "Mom, if this book character can do it, then so can I," when talking about one of her favorite book characters. She was using what she read to change her behavior. When I have traveled to various book conventions, I have made the comment to people I know, and separate from this video, like separate even from this idea, I made these comments previously, that I'm always surprised that they have very similar vibes and that they are all very open and accepting of people from all walks of life. Now, it might not be a one-to-one, but I started kind of thinking that it was maybe related to the idea that readers have a lot of empathy and actionable empathy, that because we have read and seen from so many people's inner thoughts, that we are more accepting of the many different people that might exist. So maybe it isn't perfectly measurable in the way that I would like, and there are problems, but maybe it should be enough for me that the way we experience literature obviously changes who we are, and seemingly for the better. Really quick, I want to touch on the last question I presented, which was, does cinema and video games present the same type of empathy increase? I actually stumbled into a very fun study while I was researching other things that discovered that children who participated in drama classes had increased empathy. And the funniest thing about this is they weren't even initially trying to look for that. The study was actually trying to make connections between intelligence and playing music, and the drama classes were just a placebo, and they still found that outcome. Drama classes put you in the mind of someone else, just like other forms of fiction like cinema and video games. Turns out though, there's just a lot less research in these two avenues. It seems like with cinema, there is some correlation that watching movies, especially movies that elicit a strong emotion, can increase empathy. For video games, the research is even less, and it's less conclusive, mostly saying that it's very specific on type of video game. Whereas when we talk about reading fiction, there is no such caveat. It's not really talking about type, it's just talking about it reading fiction more broadly. I think there are some obvious differences we can immediately see about why reading may be more effective at increasing empathy than other forms of media like cinema or video games. I particularly liked this quote from a BBC journalist, Claudia Hammond. Of course, you could argue that fiction isn't alone in this. We can empathize with people we see in news stories too, and hopefully we often do. But fiction has at least 3 advantages. We have access to the character's interior world in a way we normally do not with journalism, and we are more likely to willingly suspend disbelief without questioning the veracity of what people are saying. Finally, novels allow us to do something that is hard to do in our own lives, which is to view a character's life over many years. Obviously, this quote was talking about nonfiction versus fiction, but I think it's easy to extrapolate to other forms of fiction as well. Cinema is generally a lot shorter than novels, and it also has this limiting factor where we aren't necessarily as explicitly in a character's head as we can be when we are reading a novel. Similarly, with video games, while there may be video games that focus a lot on story and inner workings, it has similar limitations as cinema in terms of being in a character's head. And also there are just many types of games that don't concern themselves at all with that, such as puzzle games or more action-focused games. In the end, I guess the answer is that it's mostly a testament to something we all know, which is that art is important. Hilariously, just nonfiction caught strays all over the place in the research. I didn't know where else to say this, but I felt obligated to report on it, that nonfiction readers were reported as lonelier and poorer social skills and sometimes negatively correlated with empathy. That made me laugh. I do enjoy nonfiction a lot. But yeah, that's a story for another time. But is reading and empathy linked? It seems like yes. As always, these things are difficult to measure, but I think I can go forward now knowing that even if some of these articles don't always report it in the best way, there is research that exists to back it up. If you like these kind of deep dives into meta book topics, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.